I've told this story before. I'll share it again real quickly here, just the quicker version of it. It seems to fit with this idea of waiting, I think. My son, Tim, who's now 28 and married, of course, but when he was 6, 7 years old, we decided we were going to try out something as a father-son thing, a way to kind of keep us both busy and something to do together. So we took karate classes at the YMCA. It was over at the Southwest Y on Hewlin. And we signed up, and Tim was ecstatic. He was the one that initiated this. He really thought he wanted to be actually, back then, we were watching reruns of, I don't remember if you remember the show Kung Fu, and with David Carradine. And we were watching, and of course, he was fascinated, and he thought he was going to be, the next grasshopper. And so he was really into this. So we took the first classes, and after only the first class, we were wearing our white gis, and our white belts and stuff. And after the first class, we're driving home, and he's like, Dad, I'm pretty good. And I'm like, Tim, you're amazing. I'm all positive and everything. No, Dad, I'm as good as the sensei, the teacher. And I said, well, no, Tim, he's been practicing a long time. And he says, well, I'm pretty good. I was watching. I kick just like he kicks. And I'm like, you kick. He kicks, but you kick too. That's good. But he kept pushing this question. And so finally, he started asking, well, Dad, how long before I can be a black belt like the sensei? Because I want to be a black belt like him. How long would that take? And I said, long time. That stuff takes a lot of discipline. People work for years. And he smiled and he said, but they're not as smart as me. And I'm like, well, maybe they aren't, but still, it's going to take a long time. He kept pushing this question, and I had just gotten into this whole thing with storytelling and stuff, and I loved the stories of cultures all around the world, so I passed along this little Zen tale that I had seen in some collection. I said, there was once this great artist, I told him, and we were sitting down in the living room, and I said, and this artist had a student, an apprentice, who was trying to be an artist like him, and he wanted to be as good as the master. He wanted his own paintings to just practically leap off the canvas the way the master's paintings seemed to come to life. So the student would ask his master, how long before I can be an artist like you? And his master said, it could take as long as 10 years. And Tim knew that was a long time. He looked at me and he said, that's a long time, Dad. And I said, that's right. The student said the same thing. He said, what if I work really hard? To his master, he said, I really work and devote myself. And the master said, then it might take you 20 years. And at this point, Tim looked at me and said, that doesn't make any sense. And I said, that's what the student said. So the student said, but what if I meditate and I pray every moment I'm awake? I'm thinking about what you teach me. And the master said to his student, if you do all of that, it will probably take you at least 30 years. And the student said, I don't understand. And Tim looked at me and he was like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense at all. And the master looked at his student and said, when you realize that where you are is where you need to be, you will have achieved your goals. And Tim smiled and looked up at me and said, yeah, but how long before I can be a black belt? So I dropped it. I just said, it's going to take a long time. You know how kids after a while are like, why? Well, why? And it just never seemed to stop. And I thought, well, if I ignore it, it'll go away. But it didn't. After every class, he kept asking the question. I learned more. I'm going to be a black belt now. And he was clearly behind the other students because we started midterm or mid-semester course, whatever. And so they were mostly moved on to like yellow belts and green belts and whatnot and gold belts, and we were still at the white belt level. Well, one afternoon we were talking and we're in the car and we've got some time before class, and I tell him this little story that it's an old Jewish tale. And I said, there's this guy with a pot of gold and everybody wants to have a pot of gold like he does, and a young man discovers the technique. He goes up and asks the old man, because this man is poor. How could he have pots of gold? He lives in a little shack at the edge of the village, but he's always sitting there with the gold. And so finally he tells this one young man, I told him, he says, all you have to do is put mud, rock, and spit and stir, and you get gold. And so the young man said, that doesn't make sense, but I'll try it. And he said, that's all you have to do, said the old man. Mud, rock, spit, stir, you get gold. So he takes the pot home and he does exactly what he's told. He puts mud, rock, and he spits and he stirs. And all night long, you know what he's got? He's got sweaty, spitty, mud, rock, and that's it. And the next morning, he's still got the same thing, just mud, rock, and spit. And he takes it back to the old man. He's exhausted. He's just worn looking. And he says, you lied to me. And the old man said, I never lie. You did what I told you. Yes, I did. Formulate everything. Mud, rock, spit, stir. That's all I got. And then the old man's eyes open up wide and he says, wait a minute. Did I tell you that while you're stirring the mud and the rocks, you must not even once think about the gold? And I looked over at Tim when I told him that story. And Tim smiled at me. He didn't have his little smart aleck response back to me either. He just turned and he walked off to class. But as he was walking away from the car, he was shaking his head. And I realized what he figured out. He figured out that if I asked Dad a question, he's going to give me a story that makes no sense. So he just stopped asking. It worked. He didn't ask any more after that. In fact, it was like 3 weeks. And at the end of a class, we're standing there in line. We've been there now for almost 6 weeks. And we're standing in line traditionally at the end of the class. The sensei would call forward anyone who had been recognized, get an award, get the next belt because they'd been tested. He came down alphabetically, got to the McDermott, got to M, said Tim McDermott. And Tim looked up at me, standing there in line. I said, I don't know. And he said, Tim McDermott. I said, well, go. Well, I hadn't said anything to him. I hadn't reported a good grade or any kind of good behavior, so he walked forward. The sensei said to the class, Tim McDermott's been working very hard, and we felt it was time to catch him up. So we're just going to go ahead and skip a belt, and we're going to catch him up with everyone else because he's done so well. And so his assistant reached around, gave him the gold belt, wrapped it around him so that he was caught up with most of the students. Everyone applauded as Tim backed into line. And then as they continued reading down, Tim was yanking on my sleeve. And he was like, Dad. And I said, Tim, not now. He was, Dad. He was so excited. I said, Tim, what? He said, not once did I think about the gold. And Tim actually quit after that. He actually quit 2 weeks later, I swear, because he said, you know what, miracles like that don't happen very often, so we're going to stay with the gold. And I still have that belt in our closet. This text, you're going to say, now what does that have to do with this text? In fact, if I were looking at this exegetically, this whole text that Serini had read, you would say, well, what does that have to do with waiting? It's at the very end of the text. But in reality, if you look at it exegetically, that may be the case. It seems to have a fairly insignificant part in the narrative there. This is an appearance story, another of the appearance stories of Jesus after the resurrection. You would think, well, that's not really what this is about. But if you look at it socially, if you look at it contextually in its historical social context, there's a whole other narrative going on. Luke and Acts were written about 40 years or so after the resurrection, after Jesus died, and there was like 40 years or so of the early church's life. These stories are written in retrospect. If you look at these stories in retrospect, you start to realize waiting played a much more significant role. Because you look at some of the earlier writings that Paul had written before, say, Luke and Acts were written, before some of the other Gospels were written, and you got the book of First Thessalonians, where the early church actually thought that the second coming or that the final reign of Jesus was going to happen present in their lifetime, but it had not. Suddenly things had changed. Number one, Jesus wasn't necessarily the Savior they had expected, the Messiah in the sense of someone physically to come and to completely topple the Roman Empire and start a new kingdom. That wasn't Jesus' message. There were all sorts of expectations that weren't being met. So in the historical, social context, even if you want to think in terms of the psychological context, now they were having to wait. And so what do you do when you wait? And that's what I want to think about with you then this morning. It's interesting to me because what the early church does, in spite of that, is they do what they had always been doing as they followed Jesus around. They do what they felt passionately about: community, compassion, justice. So in the early church and the community, that's how they lived out that period of waiting. They also lived in a time of oppression where there was a lot of threat against not just their being, but their lives. How do you live in the midst of that? My mom had a stool that she used to have at her house, and she no longer has it there in her retirement facility, in her retirement village. But it used to have a knitted statement on it that said, "Tomorrow is the yesterday. I'm going to get that wrong. Today is the tomorrow you worried about yesterday. Today is the tomorrow you worried about yesterday. And then it said, all is well. The reality is that all isn't always well in the sense of what we would expect. But that is part of the problem, I think, when it comes to how we wait. If you look up the word waiting, which I always like to play around with word meanings, you look at its root meanings, and its root meanings are earliest to be watchful, as in a sense of anxious. To be watchful in the sense of almost to lie in wait, as if there's some anxiety, something that might be happening, an anxious kind of anticipation. The second idea of waiting, which came a little bit later in the 14th, 15th century, was this idea of waiting in terms of being aware, of literally the word meaning to be awake. So more it was a sense of being present or being sort of curious or interested. In the early church, there was certainly this idea in which things didn't go as expected. Things weren't going our way, things weren't going out as we planned, so what do? Do you simply throw things out the window? You participate, you become active, you become aware. This idea of anxiety and waiting, as I was asking you all to think about what it is that you really hate waiting about, it's at the root of most everything we hate about waiting, right? This anxiety, this idea that it's not going the way we expect it. Especially when we plan out things in completely logical, reasonable ways. I mean, we've worked out the details. This shouldn't be a problem. April 15th, you filed your taxes? Most of you? Most of us did. I took my form, I took my check. I was making my way from the hospital in Arlington, going to have a meeting at the church. It was 4 o'clock. That's an hour early before they close. I went to the downtown post office. There were 3 postal workers there. There were only 8 people in line. It took 45 minutes. I watched as people standing next to me were going, come on, what is your problem? Do we have to stand? Can I just go ahead and give you my letter if I don't need anything? I mean, there was just constant banter going around. 2 or 3 of us were just sitting there sort of feeling the tension, getting a little more anxious. I was doing my own deep breathing, kind of just trying to be present, smiling. And I would look over and I'd realize that the postal carrier, and I'm not trying to stereotype postal carriers, okay, but he was just enjoying his work. And so he would sit and take a letter and he would look at it and he would engage in a conversation with the person, and then he would put it over here on the weight machine and say, now you have 18 options for mailing this letter. And then he would go into each one, and then it's not as if the other 7 of us standing there weren't more than 2 feet away. We could hear those same 18 options, which he repeated with every person. And it just was like, I planned for this. I planned this out. Why did this? What is it that really drives you crazy in spite of things, in spite of your logic? At the heart of waiting is this idea as if things are supposed to go the way we expect them to go. Right? We assume we should have Wi-Fi when we want it. It says there's bars. Why isn't it there? I mean, we expect things. We have this basic sense of this illogical need to control things. There's that aspect of waiting. I'll never forget when Linda and I first went to, as a couple, went to Belize, where my father had been living for years and years. And we went to outside of San Ignacio, which is on the mainland, off the coast. There in Belize at the time, this was back in the 70s, late 70s, about 79, 80. At the time, there was only one main road that went east and west in Belize, and that was the east-west highway. And it's just a 2-lane highway out in the country. And we were staying at my father's place. He had property that was there, kind of farmland that was right there off of that highway, about 40 miles away from Belize City, which is on the coast, heading towards San Ignacio. There's only one road. It's 2-lane. There's a bridge right there that would go over a small river that was just at the base of the hill where my father's place was. And we would sit there. And I remember the first time we were actually going to San Ignacio to see the market, and the bridge was out. It had some damage to it, so everyone was having to get out of their vehicles in order for the cars and the heavier trucks and buses to go across. And as soon as that would happen, then everybody could walk across the bridge, but it couldn't hold the weight load of your typical larger vehicles. So there were about 15 or so cars in line on this 2-lane highway just waiting to get across this bridge. And the taxi driver that was taking us was sitting there, and we would look ahead as everyone slowly got off the bus, started visiting, then moved away from the bus. The bus driver was visiting, and then it slowly made its way across the bridge, and then the next car. If there was a semi, the semi couldn't go across the bridge, and so it had to be backed up, with the cars behind it having to be backed up. And then it had to be taken to the side where a winch, a big, huge winch, was on the other side of the river and would drag the semi across the river, while everybody who was in their car now got out of their car to look at the bridge so that they could see this interesting sight of the semi going across the bridge. So we would be there, 15 cars at the most, for an hour trying to get across this bridge. And I remember as Linda and I were sitting there talking to the taxi driver, "Doesn't this drive you crazy?" And he said, "No. Why would it drive me crazy?" "Because it's taking so long." And he'd look and he said, "Where else do I have to be?" And we said, "But if this makes, I mean, if you were in the U.S., if you were in Fort Worth or Dallas and this was happening, I mean, people would be cussing, they'd be waving their hands, they'd be honking their horns." And I'll never forget, he looked over and he said, "And does that help?" And I said, "Well, not usually. I guess it's sort of cathartic, perhaps." And he's like, "Well, if you want to scream, that's okay. You can start screaming. That won't bother me any. You just make it more interesting." There's this reality in our lives that we expect things to happen. That's one way of understanding waiting, is as if expectations need to be met. And sometimes the expectations are more serious. Sometimes we experience an illness, or sometimes we experience a debilitating illness. Sitting around in doctor's offices waiting for the results or waiting for the visit. Or sometimes we worry a lot about our kids when they were growing up, and we worry how things are going to turn out. And we wait, and we worry, and we're anxious. Or we worry about things not working in our relationships, and we wait. We sort of wait in our sense of worrying. There's that sense of waiting which is all about being anxious because things are not going as we expect. It's at the very basis of who we are as human beings. But there's this other idea of waiting which I want to suggest may be more what not just the gospel is about, not just what Jesus' life was about, but what this text is even suggesting, this idea of waiting for power to come. And that is waiting in the sense of curiosity, waiting in the sense of being awake. A friend of mine who lives in California, and he's actually a professor at the Pacific School of Theology over there in Oakland, California. And he used to go to this meditation center that was at the base of Santa Rosa, just the village of Santa Rosa. And he said it was always interesting because he'd go there and he would just be there to kind of pray and to meditate and to be sort of just relaxed and calm. You could kind of check in for a week at a time or just a couple of days if you wanted to have kind of a personal retreat. But he said the head monk, the abbot of the facility, would oftentimes be walking around and saying a phrase in Tibetan, which was basically roughly saying, "Gone, gone, gone, now on the other shore in bliss, awake, life is joy." Gone, gone, gone. Now on the other shore, life is bliss, awake, joy. He was saying this in Tibet, this Tibetan chant. But he would tap on the floor with a stick. And you never knew where he was, because you'd just be meditating, or you'd be praying, or you might be helping in the garden, because that was part of the routine, was to be working in the garden or doing other chores, maybe doing the dishes. And there was no prediction on when this would happen. He would just hear him tapping somewhere in the distance. And as he was tapping, once you heard it, you'd look around, and he said you'd see somebody stop what they're doing, get up and walk over to where that sound was coming from. And pretty soon you'd see people from all around the little monastic village. They would start getting together, and they'd just follow this guy until they kind of hooked up with him, and they would all walk basically to like a chapel area, and then they would all sit together and pray. And my friend said that he asked one of the people there once, he said, "How do you know when it's time to do this?" And he said, "You don't. It could happen at any moment. You're just doing whatever you're doing when all of a sudden you start to hear the tapping. Well, how do you know it's going to happen?" He said, "You just have to be ready. You just have to be aware. You just have to be," and then he used that sort of classic phrase, "you have to be awake. And when you hear it, you know to respond." What I want to suggest is, as we finish up here, just a thought. I've been talking about sort of this series about what's the big idea, what do we want to get started, what's the big idea? And here's what I think is the big idea here that I want to plant in your head. How is it that our fears, that our anxieties, that our impatience, how might it be that instead of that being a wall that we're constantly up against because what we want to happen isn't happening, how might it be instead of that an invitation to be present, to be curious, to be engaged? The word interest, I've shared this before. If you look up the word interesting, the word interest means to connect to life, to connect to existence, to be, est, to be, the Latin, inter, to connect. I've often suggested that what God invites us to be, as we follow the example of Christ, that what God invites us to be is to be interesting, is to try to connect one another to life. Now, how we do that, I think there are so many different ways. But I think it begins with us first letting go of the expectations. And instead of seeing the fear and the anxiety and even the expectation, instead see a door which says, what is God maybe trying to invite me to do here in this place now? Because we ultimately, if we're like that early church, we realize we do it together. And that's the only way it happens.